Hey guys, today we're going to talk about B12 and we're going to do two different videos. And this video is going to talk about how it gets through your system, and the next video is going to talk about B12 and the types of B12 and how you take it. Let's talk about some of the symptoms that you can have from B12 deficiency, and there's a lot of them. First off, about tingling in hands and feet. So with the increased amount of neurological problems from B12 deficiency, one of the main problems here is that you have myelin damage. And myelin is the covering of the nerves, kind of like the covering of a wire. And once it's damaged, the wires don't necessarily conduct right, or sometimes they even short out. One of the problems with myelin damage is it usually does not ever grow back. A swollen tongue, and you're going to find a lot of these symptoms come from decreased red blood cell counts or increased red blood cell size to make up for the deficiency in the numbers, and it results with a decreased oxygen to the tissue, and that's the case here with a swollen tongue. And the same with pale skin. You have a decrease in the amount of red blood cells or the increased size of the red blood cells you do have, and that's called megaloblastic anemia. And what happens is, because the cells aren't strong, they end up breaking more frequently, and we can see jaundice as a result of that. Fatigue, decreased red blood cell count, and also decreased oxygen to the tissues. Fast heart rate. When you have a decrease in red blood cell count, your heart usually will start to increase its rate of beating to make up for that deficiency. It's trying to circulate more cells more frequently to get more oxygen to the tissues. And the same thing goes for shortness of breath. You have a decrease in red blood cell count, and that means a lack of oxygen and a lack of oxygen to the rest of the tissue areas. Thinking and reasoning is very similar. You have a lack of oxygen to the brain, which can create some of those neurological thought process issues. And the next one, two, basically, you can lump them together: personality changes and irritability. And of course, it's because of lack of oxygen. Plus, B12 is important at processing homocysteine. And when we see those homocysteine levels rise, we can see personality changes and other neurological problems happen. Irritability, same thing: decreased red blood cell count and decreased oxygen to the tissues. Nausea, diarrhea, and weight loss, all the same. You have a decrease in red blood cell count, decrease in oxygen, and eventually, if you're not feeling well, you're not going to eat, and you have a loss of appetite. The first thing you have to understand that B12 comes from animal proteins. Yeah, you can get a little bit from vegetable and perhaps maybe a little bit from your digestive microbiome, but really nothing of any great significance. And to get B12, you have to eat animal proteins. And the first step in getting B12 out of your food is making sure that you chew well. I know that I'm guilty of not chewing my food well, and I know most of my patients aren't chewing food well either. But it's important to make sure that we release B12, because there's a protein called haptocorin that's produced by your salivary glands. And once it combines with B12, it binds to that and makes it so that B12 isn't damaged through the digestive process, right? By the stomach acid and the different enzymes along the way. So when you swallow B12 and haptocorin, it goes through the digestive system, and your food continues to be digested, and B12 is released, and it continues the whole way to be able to protect it. The second thing we have to be concerned about is something called intrinsic factor. You have your parietal cells, which are in the stomach, and they produce hydrochloric acid or stomach acid, and also intrinsic factor. And intrinsic factor is important to make sure that B12 gets translated through your intestinal wall into your body. So haptocorin gets it there, intrinsic factor gets it through so you can absorb it. When haptocorin bound to B12 gets through, your pancreas secretes digestive enzymes that cause it to disconnect from the haptocorin. And then towards the distal end of your small intestines, the B12 is bound to intrinsic factor, and that intrinsic factor then takes it through your intestinal walls into your system. So it's really important to make sure, first off, you have to chew well. Number two, you have to have appropriate haptocorin. You have to have appropriate intrinsic factor. You have to have appropriate digestive acid to be able to get more of that B12 out in addition to the chewing of your food. Vitamin A, D, E, and K are fat soluble, where the B vitamins are water soluble. And what that means is that you really have to consume the B vitamins on a daily basis to really get any benefit. Yeah, there's a little bit of B12 stored in your liver, anywhere from 2 to 5 milligrams. But overall, it's important to make sure that you get the appropriate amount of B12. And the big problem that we have is vegetarians, because obviously they're not consuming animal proteins. So once the B12 gets in your system, it's really responsible for 2 major enzymes. And I know this is going to get kind of crazy with big, long words, but bear with me. The first one is homocysteine methyltransferase. And it's an enzyme that makes it so your body converts an amino acid called homocysteine to methionine, which is another amino acid. And it's real important to make sure that we have that for our glutathione pathway. And the glutathione pathway is extremely important for how your body detoxifies and how it deals with just about everything. So the second enzyme is called methylmalonic-CoA mutase. I know, another big long word, but it's an important intermediary in the citric acid cycle. And that has to do with how your body makes ATP or energy within the mitochondrial in your cell. And you can see here by this little diagram, an abbreviated of the citric acid cycle, how B12 is important for making sure that we have a continuation of that cycle that generates ATP. All right, so you probably wonder why I took you down that whole track of looking at some of the biochemistry. Well, let's take a look at this article. And here, I'm just going to read it so I make sure you get everything. It says, normal or high serum B12 levels can sometimes be seen in a B12 deficient state and can thereby be misleading. High levels of methylmalonic acid and homocysteine have been identified as better indicators of B12 deficiency than the actual serum B12 levels itself. So let's go take a look at a little bit more specifics of what I already showed you. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture and go back to what we were talking about. So as we recall, vitamin B12 helped make this enzyme, methylmalonic-CoA mutase. Well, what that does is it takes the methylmalonic-CoA and converts it so it can work in the citric acid cycle and make your energy. If it doesn't happen, meaning that enzyme doesn't work because we have a lack of B12, you're going to have an increase in methylmalonic acid in your system. So when we do lab testing, we're going to be looking for methylmalonic acid, and we're also going to be looking for an increase in homocysteine because we may have a problem with the homocysteine methyltransferase enzyme. I hope that makes sense. I know it's kind of a lot of information to absorb, but I think it's important that you know that we don't just check serum B12 because we found that 50% of the time it's not accurate. So we're better to check methylmalonic acid and homocysteine. All right, well, there you have it. I know there was a lot to digest there, and this video wasn't meant for you to memorize this stuff. It was just meant for you to understand that you need to make sure that you check methylmalonic acid and homocysteine if you want to understand your personal B12 levels. And so in our next video, we're going to talk about B12, the different forms, and how much to take. There's a lot there, and it's not just simple B12 is B12. I hope this helps.